1996. A giant red neon chicken sign in New York became a punchline on Seinfeld. 2 years later, the chain behind it was bankrupt. Everyone assumes it died with the joke. It didn't. Let's go back and see what actually happened. It's 1996, and you're walking through an American mall toward one of 425 of these, a company at the absolute peak of its power. And this is a real photograph. Same sign, same rotisserie recipe. But it wasn't taken in America, and it wasn't taken in the 90s. It was taken a few years ago in the Philippines, where someone is ordering a quarter chicken and garlic rice right now, in a restaurant with an American name most Americans have never actually eaten at. In America, that name survives only as a punchline, the chicken place from a Seinfeld episode about a sign that wouldn't turn off. If you remember Kenny Rogers Roasters at all, you probably remember it exactly that way. A 90s fad that got mocked on network television and quietly died along with the joke. It didn't die. It just left the country you were watching it from, years before you noticed it was gone. And the reason it survived comes down to a single deal, signed quietly, 2 years before that show ever pointed a camera at the sign that made it famous. It starts in September of 1991 in Coral Springs, Florida, with two men who understood exactly how to sell something to America. One was Kenny Rogers, yes, that Kenny Rogers, the man who sang The Gambler and Islands in the Stream. The other was John Y. Brown Jr., a former governor of Kentucky who had, at an earlier point in his career, run a little company called Kentucky Fried Chicken. A country music icon and a former KFC boss walking into a chicken restaurant together sounds like the setup to a joke. But between them, they knew exactly how to move a product and how to move a crowd. Their new restaurant skipped the deep fryer entirely. Wood-fired rotisserie chicken, marketed hard as the healthy alternative in a decade suddenly nervous about fat, cholesterol, and everything KFC itself had built its name on. The pitch worked almost immediately. Within a few years, Kenny Rogers Roasters wasn't a restaurant anymore. It was a land grab, and it was moving fast. By the mid-1990s, the chain had passed 350 locations, spreading across the United States, Canada, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, chasing the same rotisserie chicken boom that had made Boston Chicken a household name and pushed KFC itself to launch a defensive rival line called Rotisserie Gold. This wasn't a niche trend. For a few years in the early 90s, rotisserie was the single hottest word in American fast food, and every major chicken brand was scrambling to own it. Kenny Rogers Roasters didn't just compete for a piece of that boom, it absorbed the competition outright. In December 1992, a rival chain called Cluckers sued, claiming Kenny Rogers Roasters had stolen its recipes down to the seasoning. Most companies settle that kind of lawsuit quietly and move on. Kenny Rogers Roasters answered it in the least apologetic way possible. In August 1994, it bought a majority stake in Cluckers outright, turning an accuser into a subsidiary. By 1996, the chain had crossed 425 restaurants worldwide. On paper, it was one of the fastest-growing restaurant companies in America. A country singer and an ex-governor had built an empire out of chicken and confidence. And then, at the exact peak of its growth, the chain ran into its most unlikely opponent, a real estate lawyer in New York City. A Kenny Rogers Roasters had opened across the street from his office, and its enormous red neon chicken sign glowed all night, straight into his window. Fed up, he hung a handmade sign of his own out that window: "Bad food." The story made its way to the writers of Seinfeld, who turned it almost word for word into an episode called The Chicken Roaster. Season 8, Episode 8, aired November 14, 1996, in which that same red glow drives Kramer out of his own apartment and slowly turns Newman into a helpless chicken addict. The chain wasn't thrilled about every detail. A scene where the chicken gets accidentally dusted in rat fur nearly got cut for bad publicity. It didn't get cut. And Kenny Rogers himself waved the whole thing through anyway, free advertising, he said, to an audience of millions. For 1 week in November 1996, Kenny Rogers Roasters wasn't just a restaurant chain. It was a character on the most popular sitcom in America. Here's the part almost nobody connects to that episode, because it happened quietly in the same year, and it had nothing to do with sitcoms. In 1996, the very year that neon sign was glowing into a Seinfeld writer's imagination, John Y. Brown Jr. sold his ownership stake in Kenny Rogers Roasters to a company almost no American had ever heard of. The Berjaya Group, a sprawling conglomerate based in Malaysia, with holdings that ran from hotels to gaming to now, American Chicken. At the time, it read like an unremarkable footnote in a trade magazine, an American brand at the absolute height of its fame, quietly selling off a piece of itself to a foreign investor, while every camera in the country was pointed somewhere else entirely. Nobody watching Kramer complain about a chicken sign had any reason to notice a paragraph like that. It would turn out to be the single most important business decision in the entire history of the company. The one that determined which half of Kenny Rogers Roasters would still exist 20 years later, and which half wouldn't. Because 2 years after Kramer moved apartments over that sign, the empire behind it came apart fast. The rotisserie chicken boom that had powered the whole industry cooled off. The market was saturated with imitators fighting over the same customers, and Kenny Rogers Roasters had simply grown faster than demand could follow it. In March 1998, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The following spring, on April 1st, 1999, what had once been an empire of more than 400 restaurants across 5 continents was sold off to Nathan's Famous, the hot dog chain, for $1.25 million. Think about that number next to 425 restaurants and a network spanning 5 continents. What was left kept shrinking from there. By the year 2000, only 90 franchised locations remained worldwide, and just 40 of those were still standing in the United States. On December 31, 2011, the very last American Kenny Rogers Roasters in Ontario, California, turned off its lights and closed for good. 20 years after 2 men bet everything on a rotisserie chicken, the company that carried Kenny Rogers' name had, as far as anyone in America could see, simply ceased to exist. Except it hadn't. Remember that quiet Malaysian investment from 1996, the one nobody was watching? In 2008, Berjaya bought the rest of the company outright, folding in the international operations that American executives had barely glanced at on their way to bankruptcy court. That half of the company never stopped growing. Today, Kenny Rogers Roasters still operates across Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, India, and half a dozen other countries stretching toward the Middle East. Same red rooster sign, same rotisserie recipe, run by a company most Americans have never heard of, kept alive by an investment nobody thought was important at the time it was made. Nobody in that Seinfeld writer's room knew it. Nobody complaining about a chicken sign from their apartment window knew it either. The joke and the survival were both already written into motion in the very same year. One just took 20 years longer to pay off than the other. The chain Seinfeld turned into a punchline about a sign that wouldn't turn off, didn't actually go dark. Americans just aren't standing close enough anymore to see that the light is still on. If you know a brand that quietly vanished from your side of the world, but is still out there, somewhere else, under a sign you'd never recognize, tell me in the comments. That's where the next story comes from. I'm Vanishing Era.